Academic Senate Committee on Research. And it's my honor today to introduce the Academic Senate Faculty Research Lecture. The Faculty Research Lecture in Social, Behavioral, and Health Policy Sciences Award was newly established in 2023, joining the Academic Senate's Faculty Research Lectures in Basic Science and Clinical Science. This prestigious award is bestowed on an individual member of the UCSF faculty with outstanding achievements in social, behavioral, and health policy sciences research. UCSF faculty are asked to consider the outstanding research contributions of their colleagues and submit nominations for this prestigious award to the Academic Senate Committee on Research. I'd like to thank the committee for their hard work reviewing the nominations and for selecting this year's awardee. And today we're proud to honor our colleague, Dr. Rita Redberg. And now I'm pleased to introduce one of Dr. Redberg's nominators, Dr. Sanket Dhruva. He is an associate professor of medicine in the cardiology division and a bioethicist whose research focuses on understanding and strengthening the evidence base for safe and effective use of medical devices. And Dr. Dhruva will introduce Dr. Redberg.
Thanks so much. Thank you all for joining. I'm so really honored to have the chance to introduce my dear mentor, my colleague, and my friend for almost the past 20 years here to deliver the faculty research lecture. So I was a first-year medical student back in 2006 at UCSF, taking courses in these classrooms here with a degree in political science from UC Berkeley and interested in health policy. And at that time, I reached out to Dr. Redberg, sent her a cold call of an email, and asked if she'd be willing to mentor me on a project. And I was so fortunate that she said yes, that she emailed back. And that has propelled certainly my career. I would not be here if it weren't for you, Rita, but also given me a front row seat to the incredible achievements and contributions to health, to medicine and health policy that Rita's made over the past 20 years and even more. So this is a photo from my medical school graduation with Rita. So Rita grew up in Brooklyn, New York. She then went to Cornell as an undergraduate there, and then she went to the University of Pennsylvania for medical school, where she then went on to spend a year at the London School of Economics, completing a master's degree. She completed her residency and cardiology fellowship at Columbia, and then she was on the faculty of Mount Sinai for a couple of years before coming to UCSF about 35 years ago in 1990. And we're so fortunate that Rita's been here for that long, 3.5 decades. Rita was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Fellow in 2003, 2004 in Senator Hatch's office. So in introducing you to Rita, I could start with the numbers. 388 peer-reviewed publications. Just digest that from it. 388, just an incredible number. 33 books and chapters. 14 years serving as editor-in-chief of JAMA Internal Medicine, one of the highest impact medical journals in the country. Really leading this journal in so many ways, as I'll talk about in a moment. Or I could tell you some of Rita's honors. Certainly the faculty research lecture here this afternoon is one of them, but being in 2016 selected as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Fellows Lifetime Achievement Award winner, being elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 2017. But these will really only scratch the surface of Rita's contributions, again, to medicine, to health, and to health policy. I think she's been a leader in 4 different areas, and I'll just briefly summarize them. First is in illuminating the unfortunate issue of low-value care, which unfortunately pervades our healthcare system for a myriad of reasons, oftentimes due to the fee-for-service environment. It's driven by many factors, and it most importantly has negative consequences for patients. So about 15 years ago, Rita started the Less is More series in JAMA Internal Medicine. This is her editorial with Deb Grady, how less healthcare can result in better health. Second, Rita's done tremendous work to improve payer coverage, to improve insurer coverage so that our limited healthcare resources are used for tests and treatments in which the benefits outweigh the harms, in which patients are likely to benefit. Rita served 2 terms on the Medicare Evidence Development and Coverage Advisory Committee, including chairing it. as well as 2 terms on the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, MedPAC, where she served as a commissioner from 2012 to 2018. She's the only person who's ever served both on MedCAC and on MedPAC, providing critically important consultation to Medicare. Rita's also conducted, as she's going to talk about here this afternoon, groundbreaking research in medical device regulation. In case she doesn't mention, I want to emphasize she's testified in Congress 4 times, twice each in the House and in the Senate. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't tell you that Rita's done an incredible job in conveying medical device regulation and conveying payer coverage to the public, to the audience. She's written 4 op-eds in the New York Times, multiple more in the in the LA Times and the San Francisco Chronicle. These are a couple, one about squandering Medicare's money in 2011, and one that I was honored to write with her about a decade ago about the FDA's medical device problem and problems with medical device regulation. Dr. Redberg's pioneering contributions have also included illuminating the issue of the lack of representation of women in clinical trials, particularly in cardiovascular medicine, drawing attention to this issue and the importance of understanding the potential differences in safety and effectiveness, in particular of medical devices. I also want to emphasize, just digesting the slide, the incredible array, the generations of trainees and mentees that Rita has had. I know some of you are on Zoom, some of you are here in person. All of these trainees have continued to do amazing things in research, in health policy, in clinical care, and medical education. And Rita's done all of this incredibly while raising a family. We're fortunate to have her husband, David, here, her daughters, Rebecca and Anna as well. So it really just an incredible contribution. We're so honored to have Rita here, again, 35 years delivering the 2nd annual Faculty Research Lecture. And without further ado, Dr. Redberg.
Well, thank you so much, Sanket, and I appreciate the nomination, and as well as being such an incredible colleague and bringing such joy to my professional life and so much more for the last almost 20 years. I also would like to thank Dr. Joanne Spetz, the Director of Institute for Health Policy Studies, my co-nominator, as well as the Academic Senate, and Melissa for the introduction. I'm delighted to be able to share what I've learned about device regulation in this work with you in the next hour, and I will leave time for question and answers. As my path to cardiology and to this work in particular was not straightforward, I'm going to share some of that story before going on to why I think improving device regulation has great potential to protect patients. I'd like to acknowledge that our current work is funded from the Arnold Ventures LLC. So as Sanket mentioned, I grew up in Brooklyn, and I was the first person in my family to graduate from high school, let alone college. In the last semester of my senior year, I was selected for a new alternative high school that was called Cydia School, which was a classroom without walls experience. And I chose to do one of my rotations in Greenpoint Hospital. While I was only 16 at that time, I loved the opportunity that I discovered medicine allowed me to combine my interest in science as well as working with patients. And that really set my path. And I entered college as a pre-medical student and then went on to the University of Pennsylvania. When I started medical school, it became clear to me that my journey was unlike most of my class whose parents were doctors or who had close family members who were doctors. I was very fortunate that I was able to work with Sankey Williams and John Eisenberg. For those who don't know John Eisenberg, who at that time was Chief of General Medicine and then went on to be the first director of the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, he's an amazing thinker and physician, and he really emphasized the importance of thinking about testing and treatments before ordering them routinely. And so I worked with him on a project on house staff ordering of daily lab tests. We sent notes to the house staff every morning about why they had ordered the usual chemistries and CBCs. How did these tests contribute to the care of patients? Did they lead to changes in management? Did they lead to different outcomes or improvements? And then we surveyed the different lab ordering behavior. And it turned out that these notes and reminders had no impact on house staff lab ordering, but it had a huge impact on me. And it really made me start questioning things I had previously taken for granted, which is that there was evidence to support routine medical practices. And so I started thinking, of course, there is some evidence, but there was a lot I learned that we do without actual evidence. I also learned that it can be very hard to change people's behaviors, and that the culture of medicine in particular, if it's setting a different example, makes the behavior change more difficult. And as well, I think our healthcare system has a lot of incentives which make it easier, frankly, to just draw the lab test than to think about and decide maybe I won't draw the lab test. However, I started thinking about unnecessary testing, and in particular, how it leads to sometimes harms and certainly wasted resources. And in particular, while lab tests might seem benign, when you do them frequently, it adds up. And I also started thinking about more technologies like implanted devices, which really seem like low-hanging, and technology sort of writ large, which seemed like low-hanging fruit in terms of things that could be avoided if they did not have evidence of benefit. It's estimated that at least 1/3 of healthcare spending is on waste currently, and such care is not just harmful for patients, but represents trillions of dollars that could better go to improving the level and access of healthcare for many more people. So that sort of thinking led me to apply for a Turon Fellowship from the University of Pennsylvania. And I took a year between my 3rd and 4th year of medical school to study health policy at the London School of Economics. That was incredibly educational as well as fun for me, because it was an international program. And so I learned a lot about other healthcare systems from my classmates. I also observed and studied the National Health Service. At that time, international students actually got an NHS card. And I did some rotations with general practitioners in Scotland over my spring and winter breaks. My master's thesis was on cost effectiveness of heart transplant surgery, and I followed around the heart transplant team at Cambridge during that year, having little inkling that I would go on to become a cardiologist, because at that time I had planned to be a general practitioner. So then fast forward 10 years, and this through a series of serendipitous events, namely meeting my husband, who's Mr. Serendipity there. I finished my cardiology fellowship training, had taken my first faculty position in New York, but then ended up, as Sanket gave that, I've been moved here in 1990 and have been at UCSF ever since then. I started actually based in the Echo Lab and learned everything I know from the master of Echo, Nelson Schiller. I got my first R01 in 1993 on risk factors for heart disease in women, thanks to Bernadine Healy, who was leading at the NIH at that time, and focused NIH funding on this previously overlooked topic of women and heart disease. So at that time, I changed my research focus from echo to the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of heart disease in women. This led me also to look at the representation of women in cardiovascular clinical trials. I was also becoming very active in national cardiology work at that time, and worked closely with the American College of Cardiology as well as the American Heart Association. I noticed, particularly at my first American Heart Association meeting, which was actually the late 80s, that there were very few women at the meeting, and actually 5% of all cardiologists were women at that time. And so I worked with the American Heart Association and started the first Women in Cardiology Committee. The American College of Cardiology soon followed with the Women in Cardiology Committee. And at this time, our mission was to increase the number of women in cardiology as well as leadership of women in cardiology. And I'm really pleased to say that I think both of those goals, thanks to the work of those committees and many, many other people and groups, has been successful. And the number of women in cardiology has now doubled. Of course, that means it's 10% women now, so we still have work to do. But it has, but if you look at our current fellow class, it's close to 50% women. So I think things are certainly changing. So continuing to work towards improving healthcare quality and access, as well as decreasing waste. I wanted to learn more about how payers decide when there is sufficient evidence for coverage, which another term for reimbursement. And so at that time, I was appointed to several technology assessment committees, including the Medicare Coverage Advisory Committee, as Sanket mentioned. MedCAC advises Medicare on the evidence to support new technologies which are seeking Medicare coverage. My first meeting of MedCAC was in 2003, and a guidance which makes defibrillators had requested an expansion of that indication based on the MATA-2 trial. So to expand from people who had survived cardiac arrest to a much broader population of people who were at risk for cardiac arrest. The format for those meetings was to do an evidence review and then vote on the evidence which would support the expansion request. When I noted that only 10% of the participants in MATA-2 were women, and asked the principal investigator about it, in a reflection of a common attitude at that time, he said something like, well, women don't get heart failure. He then went on to reassure the committee that in the following year, there would be a study of mostly women and ICDs. I am still waiting for that study. However, I decided it was time to learn more about the role of government in healthcare. And my family and I moved to DC in 2004, while I spent a year on professional development leave as a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Fellow. That year included introductions to all of the major policy players and organizations in DC and around the country, as well as assignment to a congressional office. And I became a health policy advisor to Senator Orrin Hatch, who was chairman of Senate Judiciary Committee, which is the committee of jurisdiction for FDA. I helped to write some legislation, which they gave me a copy of as I left the office. And for those who follow politics, back then there was still bipartisan legislation, and Senator Kennedy and Senator Hatch worked very closely, and Senator Kennedy was in our office weekly. I remember working on legislation. They would also play piano together and other things, which I think really do improve these sort of communication and relationships in the Senate. Anyway, I also took meetings with constituents and helped to write legislation like that one, which was on medical malpractice. It said that 1/3 of the Robert Wood Johnson Fellows stay in DC, 1/3 change jobs, but I was in the third that decided to return to my previous job because I was convinced more than ever that UCSF was the absolute best place for me to have an impact on health policy through my academic work. I also knew this would allow me to continue to mentor students, which I love, and to see patients, which I still do. It was a fortunate decision for many reasons, but very fortunate that shortly after returning, Sanket approached me, as he mentioned, as a first-year student, and we began working together. Our first project was this paper that looked at how representative the patients who are included in clinical trials of technologies that Medicare is considering covering are to the actual Medicare population. In other words, do those patients reflect what a Medicare population looks at, which is one of Medicare's criteria for coverage. This early work on the importance of diversity in clinical trials was published in the Archives of Internal Medicine in 2008. And in another serendipitous sort of episode, I became editor of Archives of Internal Medicine the following year in January 2009, which then became known as JAMA Internal Medicine. While at JAMA, as Sanket mentioned, I started the Less is More series with my colleagues and deputy editors Mitch Katz and Deborah Grady. The Less is More series focuses on when less healthcare can result in better outcomes for patients. It has been credited with sparking conversations around the world on too much medicine, as well as on the harms of overdiagnosis and overtreatment. I also introduced the editorial fellows program to JAMA and internal medicine, and got to work with some of our talented UCSF internal medicine residents, such as James Salazar and others, as part of that program, and they got to work closely with the editors and attend our weekly meetings. In 2009, Lisa Barrow-Sanket and I were completing another project. Now we decided to focus on high-risk cardiovascular devices. At this point, I'd been a cardiologist for over 20 years, but I, like most doctors, had little or no formal education on what it means to get FDA approval for drugs and devices. And so for this project, we decided to look at the quality of evidence that supports pre-market approval. And pre-market approval, which is also known as PMA, is the most rigorous way to enter the market for medical devices. And so we looked at all of the data for pre-market studies. At that time, I was on the FDA's cardiovascular device expert panel and invited one of the FDA device staffers to collaborate on our study. About a year into our work, it had become clear that there were serious problems with the quality of the evidence that was supporting pre-market approvals for high-risk devices, and the staffer withdrew from our study. We found that pre-market approval of cardiovascular devices, as you can see summarized on this slide, is not that stringent after all. Randomized controlled trials were not the norm, and most studies were not blinded, as compared to what was then the standard for drugs, which was 2 randomized control studies with blinding. I had kept my colleagues at the FDA's device division apprised of all parts of the trial and our results. As it turned out, not only did the FDA staffer withdraw, but apparently the FDA initiated its own parallel study of the same devices. They published their results and put out a press release on the same day as our paper published in JAMA, in a clear attempt to mitigate the impact of our findings in our paper. FDA's effort at spin control was not lost on mass device. And as you can see here, their coverage said it's not often that a few doctors ensconced in the ivory towers of academia get a lumbering dinosaur like the FDA to turn on a dime, let alone during the week between Christmas and the New Year. Our paper had published the last week in December, not the ideal timing. And then they just described our study and note that the device director, head honcho, Jeff Shuren, had the watchdog agency's own internal, he said the study touched such a nerve at the FDA device director that Jeff Shuren had the watchdog agency's own internal study of the device approval released early. Shuren, during a spin control session with the New York Times, conceded the researchers' main point. The agency needs to do a better job regulating the evidence used to clear medical devices. I will discuss what actually happened for the rest of that lecture, but I will say on that point, we agree. the agency needs to do a better job. So going on and delving a little more deeply into the evidence supporting medical devices, Sanket and I work with Connie Chen, a UCSF medical student, and then a PEDS resident here. And we looked at the use of comparators for the last 12 years of studies that were undergoing pre-market approval for cardiovascular devices. So a comparator, or a control group, you could call it, is not actually required in the pre-market approval pathway. And what we found in reviewing all of the studies was that only 40% of high-risk cardiovascular devices that underwent pre-market approval in this 12-year period had an active control group, meaning a group that was randomized at the same time that the group getting the intervention was being studied. The remainder of the studies either had no control at all, or they had what's called a historical control, meaning they compared the group getting the intervention currently to a group that had been enrolled years ago in a different study, or they used what's called objective performance criteria, which are things like, was the pacemaker inserted successfully? And if you met the predetermined goal of 80% successful insertions, that would merit pre-market approval. So I would say soon after these JAMA papers were published, as Sanket mentioned, there was a flurry of discussion and interest about medical device safety. And there were several congressional hearings on the topic. There was great interest in balancing safety and innovation. And often at the hearings that I testified at, it would be me and 3 or 4 witnesses who also represented the device industry, physician investors, or inventors. And I'll talk a little bit more about the role of Congress in device legislation shortly. But meanwhile, we decided to continue looking at evidence for devices and focus this time on post-market surveillance. And so there are 2 big buckets of post-market surveillance data. There's post-approval studies, which I'll talk about now, and adverse event data gathering, which goes into the FDA's adverse event database called MAUDE, which I'll talk about shortly. So in certain cases, the FDA will mandate a study after device approval for medium or high-risk devices, particularly if questions about safety and effectiveness, which were identified in the pre-market process, were not answered or were not fully answered. Patients and many physicians are generally unaware that questions may be remaining about device safety and effectiveness after device approval. And incidentally, once the FDA approves a device, it means that its use is then considered routine clinical care and generally reimbursed by private insurers and Medicare, which means that these post-approval studies are largely funded by payers with the costs passed on to beneficiaries. So with colleagues at Pew Charitable Trust, I studied all of the FDA's mandated post-approval studies for medical devices from 2005 to 2011. And what we found was that many of these were delayed in starting. 61% were agreed on at the time of application approval, although the FDA states that it's optimal to have the study ready to go at the time of approval. We also found that they were not all completed, and of the studies that were completed, the results were not publicly available consistently. We also found, although the FDA has the authority to issue a warning letter, a fine, or revoke with approval of any device that does not meet its mandated post-approval studies, this had never occurred. And this slide just summarizes that most of the studies that were done post-approval, only I think 1 or 2 were randomized controlled trials, and the remainder were generally either a registry had been started to continue to watch people, or that they were prospective cohort or follow-up studies. And so we felt that there were, while post-approval studies clearly have potential to improve safety and effectiveness by filling in data that may not have been gathered pre-market, that there were many opportunities to really strengthen that potential because so many of these studies were not being done or not being completed. In addition, we looked at what happened after the studies were completed and whether changes made. And the most common change that was made, and it was in about 30% of completed studies, was a labeling change. And of course, that's another question of how effective a labeling change is in another area of research. So because of the lack of the robust system for pre and post-market gathering, Sanket and I were concerned when in 2015, there was a proposal to weaken the system even further in legislation that was proposed in the House at that time. And so as he showed you earlier, we wrote this op-ed, the FDA's medical device problem. In the op-ed, we noted that the FDA's oversight of medical devices, once they are on the market, is weak, and that weakening the, lowering the standards for evidence, is, as this legislation proposed to do in the disingenuously named 21st Century Cures Act, would not be in patients' interest. However, the 21st Century Cures proposed that we would rely more carefully on post-approval study data instead. And we began, and the post-approval, the 21st Century Cures Act passed despite our op-ed to the contrary. And there was discussion of introducing unique device identifiers. That actually was introduced back in 2014, but they still have not been implemented. So we did look, just jumping ahead a few years to tell you, with another UCSF resident, Danny Hidano, we looked at, was there an increase in post-approval study mandates since the legislation passed, as that was what the legislation had said, was that we would now talk about what they had a new term, the total product life cycle. And that means don't just think about what we get pre-market, but think about post-market too in this total product life cycle. However, there was no significant increase in post-approval study mandates or other attempts to strengthen post-market surveillance that happened after the 21st Century Cures. And then it was really shocking and dismaying to learn later, as you can see, that the FDA had concluded with AdvaMed, which is the powerful medical device lobby, to write the legislation. And they'd actually had weekly meetings and had submitted wording to the FDA, as you can see. Device director and AdvaMed regularly met, and AdvaMed, these were in emails that were obtained by Freedom of Information Act by this Inside Health Policy reporters. AdvaMed thanked Dr. Shuren and the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health team for meeting with AdvaMed regularly during the legislative process for getting the 21st Century Cures Act passed. The medical device industry, I will say understandably, has different priorities than patient safety. Notably, they prioritize profits. And in particular, the term I hear commonly from venture capitalists as well as from the FDA is we have to avoid the valley of death. And the valley of death does not refer to something that happens to patients from dangerous devices. It refers to what happens to companies if it takes too long to get a device on the market and generating revenue. And so the window ideally is 5 years from the private equity venture capital point of view in a small companies to then start realizing approval. And all of that depends on FDA approving or clearing the device for market. The medical device industry says that requiring data for safety and effectiveness, which does take time, generally years, is just too slow and that it, quote, stifles innovation and prevents these innovative devices from getting on the market and helping patients. And certainly, I don't want to stifle innovation and prevent beneficial devices from getting on the market quickly. But I also think you do need time to establish that these devices are actually beneficial. And don't want to rush dangerous devices onto the market. And particularly when we're talking about high-risk implanted devices, because it's quite risky once you have something in your body to find out that it's not working as intended and it's risk and now has to be removed. Let's see, I'm doing time. I'll say, meanwhile, I continue to try to better understand evidence that routinely supports common practices. And so in reading the literature one day, back in 2010, I was looking at the transcatheter aortic valve implantation study called the Partner B trial. So transcatheter aortic valve interventions means that instead of having to go to the operating room to have your aortic valve replaced, if you have critical aortic stenosis, you could have a much less invasive procedure in the cath lab. And so this study had been done, Partner B, in patients who had critical aortic stenosis, but they were considered too high risk to go to surgery. As I read the study, I thought it was the usual randomized control trial where you had the intervention and then you randomized to conventional treatment. And conventional treatment at that time was medical therapy, even though we knew that people, once they developed symptoms associated with critical aortic stenosis, were going to do better with surgery. But if they were considered too high risk, sometimes they got medical treatment, essentially conservative watching. So I was a little astounded as I read the methods for this Partner B trial and read that 84% of the control group had not gotten medical therapy, but they'd actually gotten a balloon valvuloplasty. So balloon valvuloplasty was a transcatheter procedure that was thought to relieve aortic stenosis. It meant in the cath lab, again, you put the balloon in, blew it up in this calcified aortic valve, and that freed the valve so it wasn't so narrow and stuck anymore. But the problem was the procedure is done somewhat blindly, and the calcium goes other places and was causing strokes and killing people. And so the procedure had been abandoned about 10 or 15 years prior to the publication of this study. Hence, I was shocked to read that most of the control group got that procedure. And of course, what it means is now you're comparing the stroke rate in the TAVI group to the stroke rate of the control group is going to have a much higher stroke rate and mortality than the TAVI group. And so at that point, I fired off a letter to the journal, which they did publish, where I said, although the author is Marty Leone and company from TCT reported TAVI was better than standard therapy, I said that the conclusion was unfounded because what they called standard therapy in 84% of the patients was a wholly discredited procedure that was largely discontinued years before. And of course, and I actually, when I read it, I asked Tom Ports, who had done our balloon valvuloplasties when we were doing them back in the 90s, when was the last time he had done a balloon valvuloplasty? And he kind of looked at me like, what's up with you? And said it had been at least 10 or 15 years prior. And so, TAVI could be a great intervention. We obviously use it a lot now and the indications have expanded. But to me, I really think it's important to look carefully at data and control and try to do the highest quality study, because once a procedure is routinely used, it's very hard to go back and question the underlying assumptions. And this was just one example. I'll give another one shortly. So as I said, the pre-market approval process is the most rigorous pathway to get to market, but only 1% of all devices undergo pre-market approval. And much more commonly, they go through a 510K pathway. So the 510K pathway is a pathway where you essentially just have to claim that your device is substantially equivalent to a device that's already on the market. The FDA asked the Institute of Medicine, which is now called the National Academy of Medicine, if they could advise the FDA on how to make the 510K process more, how to improve the safety and effectiveness of the 510K process. I did get to talk with that committee when I was asked to talk to them in a consultative basis. And at the end of their 2 years of talking to a lot of people and reading a lot of documents, the IOM committee concluded that it was impossible for 510K clearance to assure safety and effectiveness because there was actually no criteria anywhere in the process for safety and effectiveness. The IOM recommended that 510K clearance be eliminated. They recommended some other things instead, including monitoring of devices throughout their life cycle. However, that report was rejected and aggressively attacked by the device industry, as well as by the FDA device director, Jeff Shuren, who you may remember from his Mass Device article and also the work with AdvaMed on the 21st Century Cures Act. So another colleague, Greg Kerfman, and I wrote an editorial at that time after the IOM report on the importance of balancing regulation and innovation and getting that balance right, just reminding that it's important to maintain and encourage innovation, but true innovation still requires that safety and effectiveness be shown in clinical trials. And so, as I said, most devices do still go through the 510K. That's used for all class 2, which is medium risk device, and it's even used for some high risk devices, which are class 3. And so now we can look at an example of one of the high risk devices that went through 510K clearance. This is the metal on metal hip, or made by Dupuy. And this was a study where I worked with 2 colleagues, Brent Arto and Stephen Graves, and we pulled through extensive review of the FDA database, as well as Freedom of Information Act requests, all of the predicate devices that led to the clearance of this 510K metal on metal hip. I will say that no clinical data was required for it to reach the market. And indeed, there was no clinical data to support it. At that time, one of the technology assessment committees I was on was the California Technology Assessment Forum, which I still serve on, as well as Sanket. And we reviewed technologies, and I think maybe you were at that meeting, Wade. We reviewed technologies, and we were reviewing metal on metal hips. So we had done the evidence review, and it's a public meeting, as was our standard, and invited people, interested parties to come. And an orthopedic surgeon from Southern California came and told us what a great innovation the metal on metal hip was. And in fact, he was using it in younger patients in their 40s because he was so confident that it would last a long time. And when I asked him why he was so confident that it would last a long time and it was such a great innovation when there was no randomized control trials, he looked at me and said, Dr. Redberg, it would be unethical to do a randomized control trial. It's that good. Well, 6 months later, this device was off the market. And it was off the market, not because we had done any post-market surveillance in the US, because as I've talked about, our system is quite weak, but because Britain and Australia do have much tighter post-market surveillance and had reported up to over 40% revision rates on this hip. And so we looked at the ancestry in this study, and this actually, the article, this is a very similar one, but this is not the metal on metal hip, but this is what it looked like. It's just the New England Journal software was too old to support showing it here from this study. But what we found was that the ancestry for the metal on metal hip went back 60 years and 95 different devices, which it looked a lot like this, including many devices that had come off the market because they had high revision rates and concerns about safety. But part of this 510K process does not mean that you can't be substantially equivalent to a device that's been pulled off the market. So that is still an acceptable way to get 510K clearance, is to show substantial equivalence to a device that's been recalled. So in a sort of positive mood, as I mentioned, it's important to have blinding in trials, but when we looked at, in 2009, at the first study, when we looked at the quality of data for pre-market approval, only 5% of the device studies were blinded, which often means you would have to be doing a sham procedure. And so this Simplicity trial was a trial of a renal denervation device. And this was completed a few years, well, this is 2014 now, so a few years after our JAMA article. And this was really the first time that the FDA had required this kind of sham control. This turned out that it's disappointing. The trial did not meet its primary efficacy endpoint. The renal denervation had been appearing very effective when it was in trials that did not include a sham control, but in this first sham control trial, it did not have a beneficial effect. And again, at that time, I wrote an editorial in New England Journal calling for more use of sham controls in medical device trials. And the specific example I used was percutaneous coronary intervention, because percutaneous coronary intervention, now commonly known as cardiac stents, or the little piece of mesh that you can put inside someone's artery to keep it open, had never been studied in a randomized controlled trial before FDA approval. And none of the precursors to stents had been studied in randomized controlled trials. So before stents, it was balloon angioplasty, then it was bare metal stents, then drug-eluting stents, but none of them had randomized controlled trials with placebo control. So multiple studies after FDA approval of these devices had been done and showed no benefit on heart attack or death, but there was still some thought that it had a benefit on symptoms. However, I said in this study and in other forums that it's impossible to say that there's a benefit on symptoms unless you have a blinded trial, which had never been done. And so in 2017, a full 30 years after we first started doing percutaneous coronary intervention, the first placebo-controlled trial of stents versus medical therapy was done, called the Orbita trial. It was not done in the US, done in Britain. And as you might guess from this title, it did not show a benefit on symptoms. There was absolutely no difference in symptoms or exercise time or any of the other 17 endpoints between the group that thought they got a stent and the group that actually got a stent. However, so I wrote this editorial with David Brown, who had been a former UCSF cardiology fellow. However, and this was the New York Times article that covered it, I will say that we were wrong about the death knell for PCI. As I told you, I learned much earlier, it's very hard to change physician behavior once it's entrenched, and the practice of PCI continues to flourish despite the lack of evidence of benefit. We decided sometimes to look at the overlap between, or the working together of federal agencies, and this was a study done of new technology as add-on payments, which is something that Medicare or CMS adds on if the FDA approves a device, and there's suggestion that this is a new technology that's very promising and can address formerly unmet needs. And so Tim Judson, who was a resident, now one of our faculty, looked at all of the new technology add-on payments approval at that time, found that, again, the quality of evidence was weak. 75% had only a single study. 1/2 were randomized. 35% were blinded. And the vast majority of them had conflict of interest statements, either in the FDA review or in the publication. And that was excluding the fact that they were all industry-sponsored trials. We also thought it was peculiar that some of the new technology add-on payments were actually for 510K cleared devices, as the definition for a 510K clearance is that it's substantially equivalent to something already on the market, yet this was supposed to be for a new technology. And these are, I will say that new technology add-on payment has become increasingly used in the last few years, since we looked at it about 5-6 years ago. So there were two, I think, excellent film directors who decided to investigate the medical device industry and made this movie called The Bleeding Edge, or documentary about medical device approvals. It premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival, and it is now, as you can see, available on Netflix. Through my participation in the film, I met Madrice Kennard, who had worked at FDA and CMS and now has her own company called Device Events. And Device Events essentially takes that post-market surveillance database, the adverse events database from the FDA, and puts it into a user-friendly format. So remember, I said there were two big ways to do post-market surveillance. You could have the post-approval studies that the FDA might mandate, or you could have collections of adverse events. And the adverse events database is actually the number one source for any kind of safety recall or warning that you see. And so Madrice has trained many of our UCSF trainees who have worked with us on adverse event studies. And one of those resulted in this paper from Christina Lalani, reporting of death in US FDA medical device adverse event reports in categories other than death. So what we did is pull out all of the adverse event reports, 290,000 in the last years in the FDA's adverse events database, and then using natural language processing, looked for ones that were not categorized as death to see whether there was any suggestion that deaths had occurred in those patients. So just to explain, when you report a serious adverse event to the FDA, it's generally observed by a physician, but reported to the device representative, and then the device company reports to the FDA. And the device company makes the decision, number one, whether to report, when to report, and how to report. So the device manufacturer has made the decision on how to classify the report, and they generally can classify the serious reports as either a malfunction, an injury, or a death. And there's a big disclaimer on the FDA database that says reporting does not imply that the device was at fault, but it just is a way of notifying so that the FDA can presumably monitor for safety signals. But what we found is that 23% of the reports that had deaths were not reported in the category of deaths. So if you were just thinking, I'm going to see if there were deaths associated and screened all the deaths for that device, 23% would be missing. And it was particularly important because the FDA device surveillance unit is understaffed and only routinely monitors the reports of deaths and not the ones of malfunctions or injuries, even though those may have deaths reported in them. So I'm going to start to wrap up now, leave time for questions, and just want to sort of summarize some of the surprising things that I learned over this journey of studying FDA device regulation. Before, or the pre-market approval, before approval, we were, as we started out in that first study, really surprised that even the most rigorous pathway does not have routinely high quality evidence of benefit. And it's particularly important because, as I've given you some examples, it's very hard to get that data once FDA approval happens. We start training in it, we reimburse, we assume everything is working well, and our post-market is not so strong. However, only 1% of all the devices go through that pre-market pathway, which is the only one that actually requires clinical trial evidence. The 510(k) clearance, which is much more common, does not require clinical trial evidence, just has to be substantially equivalent to an older device called a predicate. And those predicate devices could have even been taken off the market for safety problems and still be used as a basis for new device. For things I thought were most surprising about the post-market system, post-marketing surveillance, I think, is a weak and flawed system. I think the 21st Century Cures Act, which increased our reliance on post-market data, did not actually strengthen the system, and it really does need strengthening. Lowering the standards for pre-market really shifts the weight to post-market surveillance. It also shifts the cost, as I said, more to taxpayers and beneficiaries. And as I noted already, one example, cardiac stents, there's been multiple post-approval randomized control studies which do not show any benefit for stable coronary disease on either heart attack, death, and for the one blinded study symptoms, yet stents remain a multi-billion-dollar industry. And another concern, which I certainly, I think, have hinted at pretty broadly, I have is regulatory capture at the FDA. Many times FDA senior leadership would say to me, we would never do anything to upset our industry sponsors. I think it's important to work with industry, but I think it's important to keep in mind that the mission, the FDA's primary mission is a public health agency, and their job, I think, is to protect patient safety, and they can be doing, I think, a much better job. So I would like to say, in the course of this work, I've had the pleasure of working with many people who are really doing their best to take care of patients, to do the best job getting evidence out there. I think everyone will continue to use their efforts to shine a light on these problems. I hope we all continue to make improvements in the system. My mission, certainly going forward, as Sarah Sanket and I say frequently, we have a lot of work left to do, and I'm glad to be at UCSF where we have so many great trainees and people that are interested in doing this work, is really in building community, continuing to build community. I think it's so important to all work together and share the goal. I feel very fortunate to be here to be able to do that. And once again, I'll thank Sanket. Oh, I've got a slide for it. Sarah Bitter, and some of the names that you saw, I tried to show some of the work, but as Sanket mentioned, we've done a lot of work on this. I could not include everyone. This is just an example of some of the papers we've done, but we certainly have continued work to do. I'll thank the Academic Senate again. Thank my husband, David Larson, and our daughters, Anna and Rebecca, who are always incredibly supportive of this work and have heard many of my stories. And made it a lot of fun. So thank you all, and I hope I've left time for questions. I really appreciate you being here. Yes, Catherine, do you have a question? Does she need a mic? Yes, Joey has got a mic for you.
Rita, great body of work. The FDA,
introduce yourself for those who don't know.
The FDA regulates a lot of things, right? So diagnostics, drugs. Now they're all different in a lot of ways, but it seems to me it's all very similar in the sense of this tension between how do we promote innovation, but how do we also regulate? And with the new administration, of course, everything's going to change even more. Do you want to talk a bit about kind of the bigger picture of where you see things going, and are devices and drugs and diagnostics all going to go in some direction?
Well, thank you. I'll just say that was a question from Catherine Phillips at Institute for Health Policy Studies. And certainly, yes, the FDA does regulate a lot of things besides devices and drugs. And lab tests in food and cosmetics and digital therapeutics, which we didn't even have time to get into today, but it's just overwhelming, sort of how to regulate digital therapeutics and how to strike that balance. I mean, obviously it depends a lot on who's going to take the helm at HHS and FDA, which we don't know. We know who the nominees are. I mean, I can't say that I think it would be, no matter what I think about and said to you about conflict of interest at the FDA, I don't think it's good to have someone who starts out saying, I'm going to fire half the people that work here, which is the current nominee has said, because it's certainly not good for morale and not good, for getting the work done. I think the FDA actually needs more funding, and in particular, they need funding. And RFK has said he wants to get rid of the user fee acts. I mean, I didn't get into, part of the problem is that almost half of the FDA budget comes from medical device user fees and prescription drug user fees, and those come from the industry. And in return, the industry does have these closed door meetings that I referred to with FDA. And what I can see that comes out of the meeting is basically approve more things and approve them faster. And so that means that's where the funding is going. And then it doesn't go into the things I was talking about, like post-market surveillance, strengthening the adverse event reporting. RFK said he wants to get rid of the user fee act. Well, you can do that, I think, only if you put money in from Congress, because FDA desperately needs more resources to do the work they need to do. And he says he's going to get rid of the revolving door. But he's also said that he's going to cut half the staff, which I think would be a disaster for the FDA, because they have such a huge job. And as I said, with all the, we have so many more technologies on the market now, so much more prescription digital therapeutics, AI. I think FDA needs more staff. So it really depends, where things head, and that's hard to predict. But maybe other people in the room have more of a crystal ball here. I'm open to ideas. And yes.
We have a couple of questions on Zoom.
Great.
I'll start with Tim Judson.
Great.
His question is, I'm curious about what you think can be done on a local level. I'm reminded of a story from 2012 when a new VEGF inhibitor, Zoltrap, was approved by the FDA. Oncologists at Memorial Sloan Kettering reviewed the data and found that it had equivalent outcomes as Avastin, which was already on the market for less than half the cost. In response, they declined to offer this therapy at MSKCC. The question is, should we at UCSF be taking this type of stance on devices that do not have sufficient evidence of safety and effectiveness?
Thanks. That's a great question. And thanks for reading that. And you saw some of Tim Judson's work on new technology add-on payments. So that gets to a few different issues. We also have a somewhat broken pricing system. So, we don't really have a free market in healthcare because prices are generally secret. They're negotiated secretly and they're not made public. And people don't know prices of things before they go in to buy them. We do know that things cost way more in this country than anywhere else in the world. And the Trump has said in his last term that he wanted to move drug pricing in the US so that it would reflect more closely what other countries are paying. Don't know if that's going to be a priority at all for his next term. But certainly there are some, ideas like reference pricing, where you essentially pay for a treatment, but if there are alternative treatments, you price it somewhere in between those two. And so that would address that specific example, I think, of Avastin or VEGF. But I think Tim also said, are there things we could do locally? And certainly we could. I have to say incentives, for the hospital are not always to get rid of unnecessary or inappropriate procedures, because we're frequently very highly reimbursed. And so unless we all move to a more value-based payment system, more accountable care organizations where the incentives are different and we don't get, paid so much for doing procedures regardless of their benefit, it's very, as I learned early on, very hard to change behavior. I think we also sort of have a whole medical culture. And as I said, Sanket and I are trying to do a course for the medical students and the residents and our cardiology fellows or anyone else on sort of what I've been talking about for the last hour, but on medical device education. We'd love to see it, go nationally, because I don't think, I certainly didn't know about all of this before I started studying it, and we don't teach it. And so I think there would certainly be self-regulation if people were more aware. And I know our students in the back are experts on medical device regulation, but we don't teach it routinely. So I think that could help here, just to have more of a culture of thinking about the evidence. But I think we sort of need big changes, and we really need more of an emphasis on evidence before adopting things into routine practice. And I focus on the FDA because I think that really does sort of release, once you get FDA approval, everything else happens pretty quickly often in terms of coverage and practice changes and professional guidelines. So a move towards sort of value-based care and a tightening of standards at FDA would help, I think, greatly. Well, we certainly could do things locally. Yeah, Wade. Wade Aubrey, yes.
Yes. Yeah, I'd like to ask a question about Medicare coverage.
Sure. Joey, do you want to give him a mic?
Regarding the Medicare Coverage Advisory Committee, now called MedCat, and the change in the acronym means evidence development. I think the idea was not only coverage with evidence development, which I'm interested in your comments on, or additional evidence, even if you get full coverage. But the idea of coverage with evidence development was to collect data under protocol, basically provide provisional Medicare coverage, and therefore increase the quality and availability of evidence. I think the results are mixed, but in my opinion, what is your opinion on that?
Great. So thanks for that question. And coverage with evidence development, I'll just take a moment to define it in case you haven't heard the term before, but it's essentially a way suggested that Medicare or private insurers, but I've only seen Medicare use it, say that there is sufficient evidence to suggest that there's benefit for a particular, mostly used for devices or procedures, but could be for drugs, but it's not definitive. And so Medicare is going to offer coverage, but with some terms. Like actually the example that I gave during my talk of that ICD, so we did end up expanding the indication. I had suggested that we should only expand it in men and not in women, because there wasn't data in women, but the coverage director was Sean Tunis said, we can't do that. It wouldn't be fair to women. I said, it's not fair to women not to include them in the trial. I said, but now we don't know if it works or not. But at any rate, that decision was a coverage with evidence development. And the evidence development part was that there was a registry, an ICD registry that went on for about 10 years or so, and then was abandoned. I mean, more recently than that. So I think coverage with evidence development is a great idea because it does essentially generate more data that we really do need on safety and effectiveness. I think it's particularly useful if there has already been a randomized controlled trial before whatever it is got on the market. But inevitably, those trials are much smaller and shorter than the data we really need, particularly for implanted devices that are going to be in people for their lifetimes. And so an evidence development trial is a way of making sure you get that data on a much larger population. Generally, as that paper I showed you from Archives of Internal Medicine, the clinical trials are done on more white male, healthier populations than a Medicare beneficiary looks like. And so coverage with evidence development in a Medicare population is going to give you a much more older, diverse population. So those are all really good things. So I think it has a lot of potential. I thought the Alzheimer's drug decision, the first one, Aduhelm, where the Medicare actually said there really hadn't been a randomized clinical trial of Aduhelm prior to FDA approval that showed a clinical benefit. So Medicare said they would cover it, but only if people enrolled in a randomized control trial. I think that was a really great way to use coverage with evidence development, because that allows you to get the randomized control trial that really should have been done before approval, but wasn't. As you know, that became a very controversial decision. I think if there's already been a good randomized control trial, but you just need more data, as we always do, because a lot of safety events are rare and you're not going to find out about them unless you have a bigger trial, then a registry is a good way to do it. And that's a much more common feature for coverage with evidence development. The problem with a registry is you don't have a control group. So you have to already know that you're better off getting whatever it is in the registry than the alternative. I think the problems with coverage with evidence development is that it hasn't been introduced in a way that was kind of iterative and learning. So that, like Medicare didn't say 5 years later, we're going to go back and look at the ICD registry and see, you know, how did older people do? How did women do? You know, how did people with other indications do? And then adjust our coverage accordingly. And that really hasn't been done. So I think it has great potential. I don't think it's, Catherine, I don't know if you want to comment anymore. I know you studied CEDs. Yeah, okay, thank you. Thanks.
Rita,
Anyway,
hi.
yes.
It's Hal Collard. Hi.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
just a quick thank you for your talk. It was really lovely to hear the narrative of your career. And,
Thank you.
I just want to compliment you on your creativity and courage. I think this is an amazing example of like asking what in retrospect seems a simple and obvious question, but no one had asked before. I think great scientists do that. And I feel like that's kind of what you did. And then you followed probably a very difficult path with a lot of people pushing in different directions. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask you about just kind of another forward-looking question. If you could, you know, have the ear of the FDA commissioner, what or the device, you know, lead, what one or two things would you prioritize as changes to improve the system? Are there a couple of things that you think they may not be low-hanging fruit, but they would be really impactful and that, you know, you would want to focus on?
Sure. Thanks so much. And thanks for your comments, Hal. Sure. Well, obviously, besides prioritizing, making sure that the evidence fits the device. So I'm not saying, you know, for low risk devices that we have to have rigorous randomized control trials, but for high risk devices we do. And I think we should err on the side of evidence, because we also know that things turn out to be a lot riskier than we thought before they were approved. For most recalls that are issued for life-threatening complications are issued on devices that were thought to be medium or low risk at the time of their approval. But the other thing, like the unique device identifier that I mentioned in 2014, when we started looking at post-marketing surveillance, you know, the FDA and had said they're going to strengthen post-market surveillance, and one way is they're going to put these device identifiers, essentially a barcode, because another problem is when there is a recall, we're literally faxing people to notify about recalls. There's no way like to track where devices have gone. We have such a primitive infrastructure. I mean, that's why until I started working with recent device events, I had tried working with residents on the FDA mod, and it's such an old database that it's really hard to search. So certainly using the unique device identifiers, but I think, you know, adverse event reporting sadly only probably occurs on 5 to 10% of all adverse events. We are not required reporters as physicians. And while culturally, I know that's not what we're used to doing, it means that I think a lot of risky things, I mean, actually a study that I think James and Zian worked on, which I learned a lot from, was that sudden cardiac death study that I published when I was editor of JAMA Internal Medicine. But he could tell it better than I could, but my telling, they exhumed people that died in San Francisco with pacemakers or defibrillators in place and found that some percentage of those deaths were attributed to malfunctions that we didn't know about because nobody looked at it. And I suspect that there are a lot of faulty devices that we don't know about because nobody looked at it. Like even the Theranos story to me, I mean, we only know that Theranos wasn't working because somebody was very motivated to go in and look at it. She had gotten, you know, FDA sign off, she'd gotten Medicare sign off, she'd gotten big companies to pay for that. You know, she had marketing, was a multi-billion-dollar company. I don't know that that's not happening at other companies and we don't know about it. So I think we need kind of to change our culture about adverse event reporting to make it more public and transparent. A lot of things are secret at the FDA, even on the publicly available databases. I mean, I've submitted multiple Freedom of Information Act requests, and so it's sometimes a joke when you get them back and they say, we're pleased to supply you with what you, the entire document is redacted. Like there's no information in what they're giving you. And it says at the top, we're so pleased to fulfill your Freedom of Information Act request. And it's like, I mean, even stuff that doesn't seem secret, you know, is not. So transparency, you know, in previous administrations, the FDA talked about transparency, but they didn't really make a lot of changes. So I think increased transparency, better post-market surveillance with adverse event reporting, perhaps more of a physician role in that would be great. Unique device identifiers would be great. And learning more about devices, because I think even if we taught physicians how it actually works, people would be better able to integrate that into their practices. Yeah, Roger.
Rita, congratulations on a
Thank you.
fabulous talk. You have many friends and admirers in the
Thanks for
cardiology
coming from
community.
Hopkins just to hear it.
Exactly. I wanted to ask you your thoughts about Orbita. You
Yeah.
talked, I presume that we're still doing a fair number of stenting procedures on patients with lifestyle inhibiting angina. And I guess the people upstairs would say, well, Orbita 1 had, was negative, but Orbita 2 had a different trial design and they would consider that a win. And I guess part of it is my recollection is that they tried to take away the anti-anginal medicines that people are on in Orbita 2. And I'm just curious what your thoughts were about that. And do you still have the same concerns that you did based on Orbita 1?
I did not find Orbita 2 reassuring. I mean, Orbita 2, just to get a little bit into the weeds, but you asked, was a trial done by the same group, the investigators, which I think, I mean, frankly, the principal investigator, Orbita 1, I think was ostracized and vilified from the interventional cardiology community after Orbita. And some of the Orbita 2, I think, was getting, you know, a more acceptable trial, because Orbita 2 took patients who had angina, you know, chest pain that you could either treat medically, and then they had to be stable. They stopped all of their medicines for a month, and they had to be stable off of all their medicines for a month. That is not a group we usually are doing stents on. And then they compared, you know, the stents, and I can't even remember the details of the trial, but so I didn't find that trial very informative on practice. I felt like Orbita 1, which actually took people that had critical coronary disease, had symptoms, and then randomized them to either think they were getting a stent or actually getting a stent, was much more representative of how we would study stenting. Yes, there another Zoom question?
Yeah. So, Nora asked, what are the role of the medical directors of the device companies in these? What are their responsibilities here?
What are the roles of medical directors in?
From these companies, device companies? And then
in what regard?
Like, what are their responsibilities in terms of the process of medical devices?
I mean, I think, if I understand the question, I mean, I guess a role, someone who works at a medical device company, obviously, generally, depending on their role, is there to gather data. I mean, I guess they're, you know, they can gather as high quality data as possible, but I think their incentives are very different when you're part of the medical device company. I mean, their incentives are to design trials that will be as short and as inexpensive as possible. And so I think unless you're collaborating with independent academic investigators and have a strong independent FDA, I don't think we can rely on medical device companies to want to get the highest quality evidence, because it's just not in their fiduciary interest to do so.
Hello. Oh, Dr. Redberg, thank you so much for a wonderful talk and for sharing your journey. I'm just curious, I know you said you could have a whole talk on software as a medical device, but I'd be curious to hear, like, how would you define software, and how should we, or how should the FDA approach that? Because it's a rapidly evolving area that I think there's a lot of gray area in the guidance the FDA has provided, and I'm just curious your thoughts.
Sure. I think, Sanket, you want to take this one? You've studied software as a medical device some and prescription digital therapeutics. You want to comment? You need a mic. You need a mic. Because no one will hear you on Zoom.
Yeah, there's clearly no good answer, because there's so much evolution in because the algorithms are continuing to learn. I think that FDA had, for digital health technology, had a pre-cert pilot, were certified, I think 7 or 8 manufacturers, and then essentially said, well, we trust your processes and your quality control and such, and will enable you to proceed in marketing your devices. I think that's probably the direction that's going to go. But I think that the key, and there's a lot of people right now thinking about how to regulate AI. Obviously, FDA is an important player there. I think the key is really going to be ongoing evidence generation, so that, to the extent that it's possible, so that evidence continues to be generated as these technologies evolve, as they're updating themselves iteratively. But there is no good answer for sure, and I think FDA is definitely struggling with it a lot.
Yeah, I know Andy Auerbach in the Division of Hospital Medicine worked with the FDA for a while on their approach to software as a medical device here. And I think they basically abandoned the approach just because it was so difficult to do. My informal, I think the FDA is overwhelmed by trying to regulate software as a medical device. I think their current stance is, if it's from a reputable company, that it can get onto the market, and then, but clearly, software and its issues are growing, and the whole issue of AI, I think, is a huge challenge, and will certainly be for the next FDA director. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank everyone again. It's been really great to be able to share my story. I do want to say there's going to be thank you to the Academic Senate, and there will be refreshments. And we brought some wine from Damas Vineyards, which, remember Deborah Grady, who wrote the Less is More, she's retired now, and among other things has vineyards, and her wine is great. So please help yourselves. And thanks so much. I'll be around if anyone has other questions, but I really appreciate you coming.
Congratulations again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.